Welcome, and thank you everyone for joining us for today's PENTalk. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through the question box. We'll answer as many questions at the end as time allows. If we don't get to your question today, we will follow up with you afterwards. Tomorrow, you will receive an email with a link to replay today's broadcast. So let's get started. Hosting today is Kate Blake, instructional designer and technology trainer at Pentegra. Kate has been with us since the beginning of her career, where she started in the retirement benefits field. Kate is going to provide an overview of 5 common mistakes that plan sponsors make. And with that, I will now hand things over to you, Kate.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lizzie, for that intro. And I'm excited to be talking about some of these common mistakes that plan sponsors face today. We're going to go into detail into 5 different areas where we see that there is potential room for collaboration, value add that we can provide as practitioners to our clients and partners. But before that, let's just take a couple of minutes and set the stage for today's discussion. So even though we're all familiar with 401ks, of course, us as practitioners, but typically across the nation, people are familiar with the concept. Despite that, we see plan sponsors continuing to make very common mistakes that follow the same kinds of patterns year over year, and they're relatively easy to identify, fix, and avoid if we know what we're looking at and if we properly guide our clients and partners. Mistakes happen. I think we've probably all experienced them. It is the nature of the business because we are dealing with very nuanced data. But they can be opportunities to improve existing retirement plans for the better, but they can also be costly. So today we'd like to again talk about some of those mistakes so that we can find ways to turn the potential for errors into opportunity and a way to guide our clients to avoid those errors from happening in the first place. To give a little bit more detail specifically about the scope of these errors that we're seeing in the industry, the Employee Benefits Security Administration restored over $1.4 billion to employee benefit plans during 2023, and that's right from their fact sheet linked here that you can reference. A vast majority of these correction submissions were from oversights and omissions from unknowing plan sponsors. At the core of this problem is the assumption that many plan sponsors understand their role as plan fiduciaries when in fact many are quite uninformed. And I don't think that this is intentional, but if we think about the nature of the clients that we work with, I kind of put them into like 3 different kinds of buckets. We've got our large organizations, and with those, we may have large HR and finance teams working on our plans. And in those types of situations, the uninformed nature of the people who are working on them may come from the fact that there are a lot of cooks in the kitchen. And at larger institutions, people tend to operate in silos. So from that perspective, it's a matter of making sure that we have the right people in the room and making sure that all of those people are on the same page. Then we tend to have our smaller companies that may have an HR department, but that HR department typically tends to be, 1, maybe 2 people, and they're wearing a zillion different hats from recruitment and retention to people management to budgeting to benefits and things of that nature. So they may not have the time. And then we have, our 1-man shops or our 2-man shops, and those just typically tend to have very different needs from the other types of organizations that we previously described. And a lot of times there's just a disconnect between, what they need versus what they know. Because again, most of us tend to be familiar with that garden variety 401k plan. So we know what's happening. We know that these issues are occurring, but we need to understand again why they're occurring and how we can help facilitate these discussions in these different types of client environments. This puts us in a unique position to offer this non-fiduciary value-add educational service. And this helps us ensure that these insignificant plan administration errors that we'll look at in just a moment don't grow into something that's much more complicated and expensive. And the fact that the same errors tend to occur from year to year means that there's an opportunity to strengthen your value proposition and differentiate yourself from your competition by helping create risk avoidance strategies. None of us can see the future, but if we can leverage the knowledge that we can glean from looking at these potential issues and errors, I mean, it almost looks to our clients like we are seeing the future because we can see these errors before they occur. So this is a tremendously important skill. It, helps clients and prospects save time and money when we point out these errors and work with them to discuss error prevention, because it helps educate them on fiduciary exposure and how it can be reduced. So with that opening in place, let's now spend the next couple of minutes here talking about these top 5 mistakes. We'll look at how we can identify, fix, and most importantly, avoid these errors from occurring going forward. So here we go. We've got failure to update our plan documents. We've got failure to follow the terms of the 401k plan, which sound like similar things, but are really kind of different, as we'll talk about in just a moment. Incorrect application of the plan's definition of compensation deferrals and allocations. Misapplication of employer matching contributions to eligible employees when comp is miscalculated or for some other reasons that I can show you in just a moment. And failure to satisfy non-discrimination tests. I would say of the errors that we see, and when a new client comes on board, we evaluate their plan status and situation, and we do see errors from time to time during that process. They typically tend to fall into one of these 5 items. So let's now talk about these 5 items one by one with a little bit of additional detail. So failure to update plan documents. By far, the most common mistake that plan sponsors make is failing to update their plan documents to reflect recent changes in the law in a timely fashion. So in order to mitigate this, the IRS encourages plan sponsors to review their plan documents annually and maintain regular contact with their plan provider. And they suggest maybe implementing some kind of reminder system to automatically notify plan sponsors when changes must be completed. So let's talk about this in a little bit more detail. The IRS can encourage plan sponsors to review their documents annually until the cows come home. But if the plan sponsors don't know what they're looking at on the document, they're never going to be successful in error mitigation. So when I am thinking about plan documents and I'm thinking about keeping them up to date and I'm thinking about the potential opportunity that is there as a service provider, I'm really kind of thinking about education. We get, a lot of common questions. There's been a lot going on in recent years in terms of 401k legislation. So let me give you a couple of examples. In 2020, we had the CARES Act. Shortly thereafter, we had the Secure Act, its first iteration, and then we had Secure 2.0. I don't know of any documents that are out there right now, at least none of the documents that I work with, that are currently updated or have amendments for CARES and Secure. And the reason is because, as many of you probably know, the deadline for amendments for those 2 pieces of legislation got pushed back several times. A lot of clients are confused and concerned about this when we have these types of conversations, and they don't understand what they have to do and when. So I think it's useful for us as service providers to do this annual plan document review, because we can proactively let clients know whether or not their document is in good order, and also let them know what's coming down the pipeline. Because I think if we don't say anything, to clients about these 2 pieces of legislation, and then all of a sudden the amendment deadline comes, and it's years and years and years after the initial passage of these pieces of legislation, clients are going to have one of two reactions. They're either going to be immediately concerned and think, oh no, my document wasn't updated, I'm, out of compliance. Or they might turn around at you or us as a service provider and say, well, why are we just getting this amendment now, 4 years after this legislation passed? If we don't take the time to proactively explain the flow of document restatements, we find ourselves sort of backed into those little corners where it looks like maybe we're not providing the highest caliber of service that we could, when in actuality, we're really just dealing with the nuances of the IRS's document restatement process. And then what that also lets us do is it lets us ensure clients, that we're operating in a fashion that is consistent with regulation. But it also lets us have proactive discussions with plan sponsors, so that when the time does come to amend, we can make sure again that they're operating in accordance with those documents. So a couple of examples there. Secure and Secure 2.0 both have components that are mandatory and other components that are voluntary. The mandatory provisions, we need to adopt them. The voluntary provisions we can, but we don't have to. But the key here is that the sponsor needs to be aware of both what is mandatory and what is voluntary, and they need to have an idea, presumably through a conversation with you or another service provider, of what they might like to implement in terms of voluntary provisions, again, so that they can do it in a fashion that makes sense, and so that when the time comes to amend the plan, they'll be prepared to amend the plan correctly, so that they can correctly identify those voluntary provisions that they want to use. An example that I can think of off the top of my head has to do with some of the Rothification of employer matching contributions. That was in Secure 2.0. It's a voluntary provision, but a plan sponsor is never going to be able to implement that correctly unless we have these regular annual conversations with them in that plan document review. I also think it's important to notify or let clients know through these conversations of the timeline of how all of this happens. 401k plans are currently on a Cycle 3 document. 403b plans, though, are newer to the plan document rules and a little bit earlier in their restatement cycles. I think they're on Cycle 2 currently. So 403b plans present even more of a potential opportunity to partner with clients or prospects and help them understand these documents. While 403b plans have had the written document requirement now for several years, I still encounter 403b plans from time to time who say, I don't really know if I'm subject to a written document requirement or not, which is really kind of step one. So while everybody can benefit from these conversations, I really think our 403b plans in the mix can especially benefit from this, and there's real value to be added there. So item number 2 stems directly from item number 1, failure to follow the terms of the 401k plan. So if we think about, again, the examples that we gave last time of the voluntary provisions of Secure and Secure 2.0, if I'm an employer and I just decide to implement some of these voluntary provisions and I just do it on my own, it's not time to amend the plan, I don't tell anybody, and I just start, remitting contributions differently, for example, that is opening the window to error. And a plan sponsor may come back, if that happens, at us and say, well, you never told me to do otherwise. You never reached out to me to have that proactive conversation. So while it provides value add to clients too, it really, helps us fulfill our duties as practitioners to ensure that they understand what is required, when, how to implement changes, and things like that. But this item isn't just about making changes and amendments and, legislative changes. It can be about voluntary provisions as well. There are some that jump out to me as ones where I consistently see errors. It has to do with eligibility and entry dates. When we have those annual plan design or plan document review conversations with clients, that's a great opportunity to help recommend plan document terms that work for a client's needs. When we think about eligibility and entry dates, a large organization may want to get employees in the plan and saving right away as a method of recruitment and retention. So they may have immediate eligibility with perhaps monthly entry, or that's a bad example. Maybe they have a 1 month waiting period with monthly entry. Conversely, if I am, as we gave the example before, that smaller employer with the one HR person wearing a zillion different hats, maybe a semi-annual entry date might be better because I simply may not have the resources to facilitate new hires, getting enrolled into the plan every month. So we want to make sure that we not only review the plan document with sponsors, but identify those potential trouble areas, eligibility and entry as the example here, and then have that conversation with sponsors where we discover their needs, discover their strengths and weaknesses, and then that lets us recommend provisions that a client is going to be better able to operate in compliance with. Other examples, too, that pop into my head include things like break-in service rules. There are a couple of different break-in service provisions that a sponsor could potentially employ. And the other one that I think of relating to the document are true-ups. Some plans provide for true-up contributions where, say, an employee maxed their contribution earlier in the year and as a result perhaps did not receive the full employer matching contribution. If a plan provides for a true-up, we can make that employee whole, so to speak. If a plan does not provide for a true-up, we cannot. I've seen situations where maybe somebody comes to a company and they came from another company that had a true-up, and the company that they moved to did not have a true-up, but they just continued to operate as if it existed because that's what they were familiar with from before and they thought it was standard in the industry. That's another example of where this annual plan document review can help nip these issues in the bud, because again, it's not always, it's rarely malice or anything like that. It's usually just simply, I thought this is the way it was. This is how we did it at a prior employer. I don't have the resources to handle this provision. Things of that nature that, again, we can help proactively address through these annual discussions. The third one, these are all tied together, as you can see, because this too is something that is defined in the plan document, which is the definition of compensation. Plans use a lot of different definitions of compensation and for different purposes. Some plan sponsors can get mixed up when it comes to applying the proper definition when dealing with deferrals and allocations. So in our document that we frequently work with, we can define different definitions of compensation, as you can see here, for different types of contributions. Again, think about the types of clients that you're working with. If you do have that savvy, large employer that is using this plan for recruitment and retention purposes, maybe having that nuanced definition of compensation makes sense. I'm thinking here about things like inclusions and exclusions, maybe bonus and overtime and things of that nature. But if we have a smaller employer, again, that just may not have the resources, maybe we want to recommend a simpler definition of compensation with less exclusions. It's both the definition of compensation and the exclusions that can potentially cause issues, not only for the contributions that are remitted, but for plan testing later on. Typically, in my experience, though, I tend to think that a simpler definition of compensation usually is better, even at those larger, more robust institutions, unless, again, there's a specific need to make an adjustment to compensation, which does exist from time to time. A lot of clients will just use a default definition of compensation that was elected when they first started the plan. And they may never have had anybody really sit down with them and review actually what that means. For example, even if the plan just uses a simple W-2 definition of compensation, there may still need to be adjustments that are made to what gets reported on the non-discrimination testing. I think this is really interesting too for us as practitioners from an ethics perspective. I happened to listen in on an ethics webinar before this just to get in my own personal ethics CE credits. And I was kind of shocked at how closely the content of their presentation mirrored the content of what I was planning to show today. And I think that just speaks to the nature of why this is so important. I personally have had clients come to me and say, Kate, oh no, I've made a terrible mistake. I've been reporting the incorrect definition of compensation now for the last 10 years. Can we just kind of pretend that this didn't happen and, move forward in a different fashion, doing the right definition of compensation? These types of questions really become ethical in nature because, our own licensure and the reputation of our own organizations comes on the line when these types of errors occur, and then, clients say those types of things to us. Of course, we cannot sweep it under the rug, but then that typically tends to, ruffle clients' feathers a little bit. Clients don't like to be told, hey, you have to correct this error. You may have to pay money to correct it. So if we can have these conversations up front in advance before the errors occur, then it is much easier, both from a client standpoint in terms of their corrections and budget, and our needs in terms of ethics from a professional standpoint. The definition of comp, too, when I think of this, I also think of things like matching contributions, the formulas that are used, and also the formulas that are used for profit-sharing contributions. When it comes to matching contributions, I tend to think that a simpler contribution is easier. When we tend to get in the formulas that are 100% on the first X and 50% on the next Y, contribution amounts, from an employer standpoint, it can get more difficult for HR representatives and people working on the plan to calculate those match amounts. So the simpler we keep it, the easier. And it's also important to make sure that our clients understand how profit sharing calculation works, because there are many different ways that can be calculated as well. The area where I typically tend to see the issues are with the pro rata profit sharing calculations. Misapplication of employer match when an employer miscalculates the employee's compensation. I sort of jumped ahead of myself a little bit here, but this is what we were just talking about. So because those plans can use different definitions of comp for different purposes, sponsors can get mixed up. This can cause problems because a plan's compensation definition has to satisfy ERISA rules for determining contribution amounts. This also tends to be a problem, I find, and this speaks to the third bullet point, when there is employee turnover. So typically, when I was providing consulting services to plans, I would do my annual plan review meeting. That was my standard. I typically tended to do that in the spring. That would give sponsors the summer and early fall to evaluate their plans, and plenty of time to get an amendment in the fall and winter before the 1/1, fresh start to the year, which typically tends to be when most people want to amend plans. But also, In this vein of training, if there ever is any turnover in an HR department, in a finance department with a client, I will always proactively reach out and offer to talk about the plan document, specifically in the context of these top 5 mistakes. That is an opportunity to start out a new relationship with a clean slate and also make sure that that person who's coming on board has a full understanding of how this plan works so that you avoid those issues I mentioned before of, the new HR rep coming in and thinking true ups are standard across the industry. And lastly, item 5, which is failure to satisfy non-discrimination tests. So of course we have, the ADP, ACP tests that we have to do each year. Sometimes sponsors fail those tests if they do not have enough non-highly compensated employees participating in or contributing at a high enough level in the plan. The ways to correct the testing failure, of course, are the automatic enrollment or securing some type of safe harbor arrangement for the plan. This actually is interesting to me because I think there is currently some litigation out there about safe harbor plans. I think a lot of practitioners typically tend to think of the safe harbor as, okay, well, this is kind of the fail-safe option or the safe option that, the IRS is kind of specifically designated. If we do the safe harbor, we don't have to have testing, employees get a defined contribution, and everybody's happy. But we have to make sure whether we're recommending auto-enrollment or even something as innocuous or seemingly innocuous as a safe harbor design, that we make sure we think about those plan sponsor needs. A small employer with a business owner who wants to maximize their contributions each year might not be a good candidate for a safe harbor plan if we really dig into, for example, their budget. It may satisfy the need of eliminating the testing and allowing the HCEs to max their accounts. But if it is a small employer and the budget doesn't provide for making that safe harbor contribution from year to year, that might not be the right plan design. And you might instead want to recommend something like automatic enrollment. So knowing the problem, in this case non-discrimination tests, and knowing the potential solutions, auto-enrollment or safe harbor, there's more to the equation than that. Again, we need to have these conversations, preferably annually, with the plan sponsor so that we can help discover their business needs to make sure that we're not only helping people avoid these errors, but really recommending solutions that are in the best interest of our clients. So with that said, to sum up, make sure you choose your retirement plan partner wisely. Some partners have, education materials, webinars, and things like that on avoiding these issues, plan design, and things of that nature. Ensure that the partner provides the tools and resources you need. So whether it be those education tools, plan document guidance, operational guidance, things of that nature, we all work in tandem to provide this comprehensive service for our clients. Make sure they provide the right amount of training and support that you need for each client. So we can offer a lot of value here. It not only helps reduce their fiduciary exposure, but also limit clients' personal liability when we help them proactively identify these issues and proactively recommend the right solutions for their needs. And they look to us because we are the most capable and best positioned as industry experts to help them monitor and fix these mistakes. And by focusing on these top mistakes, we can provide value in a way that is visible and really impacts their bottom line to help them save money, improve their plan design, and limit their fiduciary exposure. So with that, I think I'm just about at time. So Lizzie, I'll turn it back to you to help close us out.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. And thank you everyone for attending this afternoon. You will receive a link to replay today's broadcast tomorrow. If you have any last minute questions, please submit them through the question box right now. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day.